Those who serve our country are asked to make many sacrifices, to leave their families, to go to war, but some we ask much more of. Those taken prisoner by the enemy, those who never return. Stay with us as we talk with former prisoners of war and remember Americans still missing in action. The meetings of veterans organizations all across the country are often started by giving tribute to those taken prisoner or lost in war. We felt it appropriate to start this show with a ceremony presented by Marine veteran Mike Feddersen from the Vietnam Veterans of Diablo Valley.
There seems to be a phrase that resonates throughout those who served in our nation's military, and that is that all gave some, and some gave all. And to those who have served and those that are currently serving in the uniformed services of the United States are ever mindful that the sweetness of enduring peace has always been tainted by the bitterness of personal sacrifice. We are compelled to never forget that while we enjoy our daily pleasures, there are those who have endured and still may be enduring the agonies of pain, deprivation, and imprisonment. We pause to recognize those that are still considered as prisoners of war, to those who are missing, and to those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice to ensure our nation's freedom. I would like to direct your attention to this small table that occupies a place of dignity and honor. It is a setting for one symbolizing the fact that members of our armed services are missing from our ranks. We call them comrades. They are unable to be with their loved ones and their families, and so we join together to pay humble tribute to them and bear witness to their continued absence. And as you look upon this table, you'll notice that the tablecloth is white, which is symbolic of the purity of their intentions to respond to our country's call to arms. The single red rose that is in the vase reminds us of the blood that they may have shed while enduring peace for our beloved United States of America. The red rose also reminds us of the friends and families who keep the faith while awaiting their return. The yellow ribbon that is tied around the vase reminds us of the yellow ribbons that are worn on the lapels of thousands who demand with unyielding determination a proper account of our missing comrades who are not among us. There is a slice of lemon that is on the plate that reminds us of their bitter fate. The sprinkle of salt reminds us of the countless fallen tears of the families as they wait. The wine glass is inverted, for they cannot toast us at this time, and the chair is empty, for they are not here. The single lighted candle is reminiscent of the light of hope that lives in our hearts, illuminating their way home from their captors to the open arms of a grateful nation. And the American flag reminds us that many of them may never return and who have paid the supreme sacrifice to ensure our freedom. So let us pray to the Supreme Commander that all of our comrades will soon be within our ranks. And let us remember and never forget their sacrifices. And may God watch over them and their families. God bless America. And God bless the men and women who have served and those that are currently serving in the uniformed services of these United States of America.
Thanks for tuning in to Veterans Voices. I'm Nathan Johnson. Tonight, our conversation will serve to honor and remember American prisoners of war and those missing in action. If you want to be part of the conversation, we'd love to have you. Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1 or email us veteransvoices@ContraCostaTV.org. We know that the constant stream of images from the war in Ukraine may be upsetting to the veterans community for many, many reasons. If you need someone to talk to right now, you can always find someone who understands at a vet center, Just go to vetcenter.va.gov or call 877-927-8387. You're not alone. To begin our panel, I want to welcome the National Commander for American Ex-Prisoners of War, Robert Certain, and Robert is also an ex-prisoner of war, and ex-prisoner of war Obi Wickersham to the show. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us tonight. What an honor it is to have two former prisoners of war on our show tonight. And gents, please give us just a quick little bio of your military service. We'll get into talking about your time as a prisoner of war, but let us know what branch and what period of service you served in, please. Obi, get us started.
Yes, being a reserve, I was called back in at Korea. I was supposed to be a paratrooper, but they didn't have people over there. But I joined the 2nd Division. I was a platoon sergeant with the 3rd Regiment with the 2nd Division. And from there, after 5 months, we were called up and got into a major battle. And I was captured there by the Chinese. And I would serve 28 months in a POW camp.
Thank you, Obi.
Excuse me.
Oh, thank you, Obi. We'll come back to you in just a second, sir. Robert, can you just introduce us to your military service? What branch and what period of service?
It was in the Air Force. I was a B-52 navigator. I had 2 deployments to Southeast Asia. In 71, I went to Utapao, Thailand, and then in 72, I came back to Anderson Air Force Base from Guam. And the day I was supposed to have rotated home, instead, my crew was kept over to fly the first night of what was called Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. And then we were in the first B-52 to be shot down with the crew captured over Hanoi. I spent 100 days in prison and was released on the 29th of March, 1973.
Wow, incredible. Very significant. So, gentlemen, you have a lot to share in regards to your stories. And Obi, I somewhat interrupted your beginning to share 28 months as a prisoner of war held by the Chinese. And this is after you served in World War II. I don't imagine that you woke up that morning or even went into battle thinking that your time in Korea would end as a prisoner of war. But what was that experience like when you realized that the Chinese were capturing you and taking you as a prisoner?
Well, all I can say is when they took me back in, I knew being in the reserve that if something happened, I would be called, and I was called. And I went over and joined the 2nd Division as a platoon sergeant. And I thought, well, I've got something to fight for, and I fought for 5 months. And in a major battle that the Chinese wanted to get back to Busan, I had the men up on mountain number 800 and the division and the battalion were badly hit and leaving, and my platoon could not get away, and some got away. Myself, one of my sergeants, and 2 ROC soldiers that you saw pictures of survived, were captured, and made the last long before. And we started our long trip, 500 miles to the Yellow River in North Korea.
Wow, incredible. It's remarkable to think that you survived 28 months being held in North Korea by the Chinese. Robert, I want to come back to you. I would imagine, as I asked Obi the same question, you didn't wake up that morning or maybe even head to Vietnam thinking that your experience in that war would end as a prisoner of war. What was the moment like when your plane was shot down and you were, I think what you described, jumping from the airplane, parachuting down into Hanoi and captured there? What was that experience like initially?
Well, it was a big surprise to us. First of all, we were 8 hours and 40 minutes into the flight when we got to the target, and everything was going perfectly well. The radar was working very, very well. We were exactly to the second on time. And about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 seconds before we were releasing our weapons, we were hit by the first surface-to-air missile, which doesn't really hit the airplane, it just blows up in front of it, and the aircraft flies through all that shrapnel. We assessed our damages. We had 2 mortally wounded crew members. We had fire in the airplane. It was time to drop the bombs. The bombardier and I released the weapons in a hurry. And then because the airplane was on fire and we had 100,000 pounds of jet fuel on the airplane, it was time to leave. So we ejected basically at the bomb release point at about 32 to 35,000 feet. Free fell for until we reached 15,000. And then when we reached 15,000, the parachute opened. I was hanging right over the target, looking down at all those bombs blowing up in the rail yard to the northeast corner of Hanoi. Drifted to the west and touched down about 15 minutes later on a plowed field that was next to a railroad track. I rolled into a ditch that paralleled the railroad track, but we had a full moon, and I was surrounded at a little bit of a distance by a whole crowd of locals, civilians mostly. And so I was not going to be able to do any evasion and was captured within 5 minutes or so. From there, I was taken in stages from one village to another until we got to a road, and then driven into Hanoi and arrived at the Hanoi Hilton around probably midnight.
Remarkable. Wow. It was such an honor to talk to 2 former prisoners of war, and they've just started to share their experiences. And if you have questions or comments for them, we'd love to hear from our audience. Now, it's called the Hanoi Hilton, and I know you were in Camp 1, Obi, but give us some of the day-to-day experiences. I know the living conditions were great. The food couldn't have been great. I'm sure that it was very crowded. But on a day-to-day basis, what do you do with your time? How do you spend your time as a prisoner of war? Do they have you completing certain laborious tasks, or are they just isolating you in a cell?
Well, first of all, after I was captured, we had no medical whatsoever. We had no food. We were put in a cave for one day. We got to the first camp. We buried a lot of good soldiers. I buried one of my sergeants that was found for 57 years later, and I attended his grave in Washington. But as far as how I survived because I was not going to let those soldiers in the Chinese army get me to stay in China or Korea. Walking a lot, staying active, saying I'm not going to give up. And like some people that would just sit down in the corner of a mud hut and not take care of themselves and pass away. You got to have it in your head that you're going to beat this and you're going to go home and see all your family and the ones you loved.
Wow. Remarkable. Well, this show is about former prisoners of war. So we have a question from our audience. How did you first find out that you would be released? Robert, do you want to share that with us?
Sure. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on the 29th of January. And one of the terms of that accord was that all the prisoners on both sides would have to be notified within 2 or 3 days. So a couple of days later, we were in the Kulak prison, the Hanoi Zoo, were brought into an assembly room and were told that the Paris Peace Accords had been assigned and that prisoners would be released on an every other weekend schedule for the next 60 days. So since I was one of the last to be captured, I knew my rotation date would be 60 days after the treaty, so that would put it at 29th of March, 1973. So after that, those last 60 days for us were what we call short. We could become a lot more confident in our behavior. We didn't have to worry about harassment too much. Food got better, and and we were able to see the traffic pattern at the Jialam Airport in Hanoi from our cell windows. So when those 141s started coming in to pick up a group of POWs, and we could count down the days to when we would be mounting one and going home again.
Remarkable. Obi, we just have about 30 seconds, sir. What was the first thing you did, Obi, when you got home after being a prisoner?
I saw my folks in San Francisco waving when I got off of that boat. It was like nothing had ever happened this before. It was great.
Remarkable. And Robert, you, sir, what was the first thing you did after you came home from being a prisoner of war?
Well, I embraced my wife for one thing, and then my parents were there too, and my second grade school teacher was there. So I embraced my wife, my parents, and some other friends who had made it up to Scott Air Force Base to welcome me home.
Remarkable. Well, gentlemen, you're going to continue with us. We have a whole lot more show to cover this topic. We're going to add another guest, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. But first, let's take a look at my recent interview with Gary Powers Jr., whose father was arguably the most famous American prisoner of war in history. I'm speaking with Gary Powers Jr. today, the son of Gary Powers, a former prisoner of war, famously known for the U-2 incident that happened in 1960. Welcome, Gary.
Hello, Nathan. Thank you for having me on today.
Your father, from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong here, your father was a prisoner of war in the USSR in the 1960s after he was shot down in the U-2, is my understanding. He spent a couple of years imprisoned there and was released. And the circumstances are interesting to me because it seems like he was serving in the military at the time, but actually was working under the CIA. So although I guess it was a CIA specific mission, his service in the military was still active duty at the time. So he received a Silver Star, he received a Prisoner of War medal and such. And so that's my understanding.
You've got the overall big picture correct.
Good,
but it's
okay.
a lot more detailed than that because it
Okay.
depends on what time you're talking. If you're talking in 1955 to 1960, it was a CIA U-2 program. It was a civilian agency running a civilian program. Eisenhower did that intentionally because he did not want it to be a military plane with a military pilot flying over a foreign hostile country. That would have been an act of war. Eisenhower wanted to gather intelligence. Fast forward to 1998, declassification conference. The Cold War has now been over for a few years. The Soviet Union no longer exists. These declassified files are becoming available. In 1998, the U.S. military, U.S. Air Force, and the CIA at a joint conference in Washington, D.C., declassified the U-2 program. In that document that was declassified, the manuals that were generated from the conference, it showed that it was a military operation, that the CIA was working hand in hand with the U.S. Air Force, and that for all intent and purposes, it could not be separated. There were military pilots that were sheep-dipped out of the U.S. Air Force to go fly for the CIA, and then they could go back into the military at a rank comparable to their peers with no loss of duty time. So after this was declassified, and that word military was declassified, that it was a military operation, that opened up the door for my father to be honored as a POW.
And did he ever talk about his experience as a prisoner of war? Did he ever talk about what it was like to be incarcerated and how that had, if at all, any permanent effects on his mental health or even his physical health?
I remember talking with my father when I was a kid, before age 12. My father died when I was 12 years old, so I've got memories as a kid. And I'd ask him what it was like to be interrogated. Were you tortured? How'd they treat you? And I remember asking him these questions in a conversation we had. And he basically said that there was no physical torture, but there was mental anguish, mental torture, sleep deprivation, bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, Mutt and Jeff and or good cop, bad cop scenario. One big burly KGB guy would come in yelling and screaming at him, trying to get him to tell what he knew, threatening to kill him the next day. Another guy would come in after that, sit down, offer him a cup of coffee. Mr. Powers, you help us, we can help you. Trying to get him to cooperate short of physical abuse. And I discovered that there was no physical abuse. Primarily, he was too high profile a person at the time. The world knew that the Soviets had captured Gary Powers.
Gary, when your father was shot down, one of the Soviet MiG pilots was also killed by a Soviet friendly fire. And in 2017, you went to honor the grave of that Soviet pilot. Can you explain to us why you made that decision?
I had the privilege of meeting the MiG pilot's son about 8-9 years ago. Through a translator, he told me during the course of an hour plus conversation that his mother did not blame my father for her husband's death. She knew that my father was following orders, that her husband was following orders, that it wasn't his fault, my father's fault, that her husband died by friendly fire. I took that to heart. I was very happy to know there was no animosity between the two families. So when I went to Sverdlovsk, Yekaterinburg in December 2017, I made it a point to pick up some flowers and go and pay my respects to Sergei Safronov, the MiG pilot who lost his life on May 1st of 1960. I just thought it was an appropriate thing to do to show the family there was no animosity, to show the Russian people that I was paying respect to the MiG pilot that lost his life. And it was very emotional at the time. It was a wonderful experience. And that's why that photo is on the front page of my homepage.
Gary, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great opportunity to interview you.
Well, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed my time with you. I hope to do it again sometime.
Thank you. Welcome back. Tonight, we're talking about prisoners of war and those missing in action. Do you want to be a part of our conversation? Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1 or email us at veteransvoices@ContraCostaTV.org. Now, I want to add to our conversation by welcoming Ann Mills Griffiths to the show. She is the chairman of the board and CEO of the National League of POW MIA Families. Ann, welcome to our show tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Obi and Robert talked a little bit about their experiences as former prisoners of war or returning prisoners of war, as you mentioned earlier. But there is a national organization or organizations or national effort to bring prisoners of war or returning prisoners of war together and to seek out the remains of MIAs or those who are still missing in action and those who are still prisoners of war. And you're one of those organizations. Tell us a little bit about the National League of the POW MIA Families.
Well, we were formed in 1970, before the end of the Vietnam War. And the reason then is the same reason we have now. And that is the release of all POWs, the fullest possible accounting of the missing in action, and the recovery of all possible remains to return them, identify them, and bring them home. So our purpose has been the same since before the end of the Vietnam War. We celebrated, as everyone did, when Bob Certain and his fellow POWs from the Vietnam War came home. And I'll just say that one of the proudest achievements that we have as the National League of Families is that our effort to support and bring home those missing in action from the Vietnam War has now expanded to include recovery of remains and identification of World War II and Korean War heroes of our country. That and the fact that we've done a lot of this because of those who serve our country now and have since the Vietnam War, to make sure that they know that if they get captured or are missing in action, our country will do its very best to ensure that they come home, as is the appropriate role of the United States.
A very important mission. I'm glad this organization exists. Now, Ann, what is your connection? I know you're the chair of the board and the CEO, but how did you find yourself doing this kind of work?
Well, it was not expected, nothing you planned for. My brother became missing in action on September 21st, 1966, which is pretty early during the Vietnam War. But my family never expected to get him accounted for and returned to our country. It is a requirement to be a voting member of the National League of Families, and my father preceded me as executive director, as it was called at the time, and as chairman of the board. But he got leukemia and could not continue. And I was the one who was called on to represent my family. I was able to do it. I did it. I've been doing that for almost 50 years now. But I'll just say that my brother's case being resolved was nothing short of a miracle. We never expected it. You don't fly off of an aircraft carrier going hundreds of miles an hour, fully loaded on a nighttime, low-flying bombing mission and disappear off radar and really ever expect to get anything. We didn't, but because of a Vietnamese fisherman along the extended shallow coastline of North Vietnam, he snagged his fishing net on underwater wreckage. But there are many, many, many aircraft underwater along that shallow part of the coastline of Vietnam. It turned out, after a lot of investigation, it was the aircraft in which Commander Jim Bowder, or then Captain by that time, Jim Bowder, and my brother, by then Commander Jim Mills, were lost, and they recovered fragmentary remains of Jim Bowder in 1917, and then in 2017, sorry. And then in one more effort, they recovered fragmentary remains of my brother in 2018. Both were identified, and we buried my brother on June 24th, 2019 at Arlington National Cemetery. And it just proves that there's no such thing as a lost cause, and there is always hope as long as there are dedicated people working in the right way with counterpart governments to try to get answers. And that's the responsibility of our government. It's what we've worked to put into place. And it is now the most admired such effort in the entire world.
I absolutely agree. Very important subject. And I'm so glad that your brother's remains were recovered and that he was able to be buried with honors at Arlington National Cemetery. And thank you so much for the work that you'll do. And then we'll get more into those details here in a little bit. But Robert, our other guest, also represents a national organization or a national effort to help returning prisoners of war, and that is the American ex-POWs. And Robert, you're the national commander of this organization. Tell us a little bit about who this organization is and how they help former prisoners of war.
Okay, the American ex-POW started initially after World War II, and it was mostly World War II veterans and former POWs. And it was a very active organization in Washington, working with the Department of Veterans Affairs to make sure that the VA was advocating for and properly caring for former POWs, bringing them in for protocol physicals, assigning any disabilities and that sort of thing, and helped to organize a VA advisory committee on former POWs, which is still in existence. Over time, as our population started to die off and the organization got smaller, we withdrew from Washington and that kind of activity, but we also welcomed into our members some people like me, Vietnam POWs, Korean POWs, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, returned POWs who have been part of this, so that we can continue the effort to make sure that returned POWs are properly cared for by the Department of Veterans Affairs and have the kinds of support for themselves and their spouses, and as long as they live, and for the surviving spouses for as long as they live. So that's kind of where we are. It's a voluntary organization. So we don't include all people who've been prisoners of war in any of our conflicts, but we do represent and speak for them.
Well, it's remarkable, and I'm glad that there's an organization who brings these ex-prisoners of war together and who advocates on their behalf to ensure that they have access to these very important VA veterans benefits. And doing this line of work, I know that there are certain presumptive conditions that former prisoners of war can establish for service connection. So it is very important that these veterans connect with these organizations. And I want to come back to you because I think we have some pictures that we skipped over the first time that we talked about your experience. And so we have some photos that we'll bring up here. And if you could just comment and guide our audience on what these photos capture. I think one of them is you standing at a lectern, maybe in front of an audience, maybe a moment which you represented the National League of POW MIA families. Tell us about this photo here.
Yeah, that one was at the Air Force Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was one of the awareness events that we were speaking at, advocating veteran support for our efforts to account for their comrades in arms. And because Air Force had the greatest losses in terms of POWs and MIAs in the Vietnam War, Air Force was particularly important. There were many that were lost from the Army and the Marine Corps, but ground personnel, by and large, were a minority of those who were listed as prisoners of war or missing in action. Those were Air Force, Navy, off of aircraft carriers, and Marine Corps pilots, and some Army pilots, particularly flying in support of our special operations teams in Laos and Cambodia. So largely air crew were POWs and MIAs. Most of the rest were killed in action, body not recovered. That was an Air Force event, and I was very proud to be there representing the POW MIA families.
Remarkable. And we have another photo of you in Washington, D.C. I think this is one of you in front of the White House. Is this a recent event that took place? And what was the event with you that took you to the White House?
Okay, that was, our flag is mandated by law now to fly at the White House. And it was restored to that place. It was up there before. During the Reagan administration, it flew there on 6 days a year, starting with Armed Forces Day, then Memorial Day, Independence Day, Flag Day, National POWMI Recognition Day, and Veterans Day every year. And then a lot of very well-intentioned supportive veterans started fighting for it to fly 24/7, 365. It took a lot of effort on their part, and it was somewhat controversial, but it is now a matter of law. And that photograph shows our flag flying under the U.S. flag over the White House, where it flies that way today as mandated. The other one was just a picture of me in the office with a painting of my brother that was done by the same guy who did all the original theme-motivated National POWMI Recognition Day posters. Tom Nielsen, Vietnam veteran, he's no longer living, very talented artist who went to work for the Veterans Administration after his Brownwater Navy career in the military.
We just have 1 minute, and I don't think a lot of folks know about this, the association of the National League of POW MIA families and the POW MIA flag. That flag is flown at our office here in Martinez and is flown over the nation, the White House, excuse me. So this is a flag that is a part of the National League of POW MIA families. Where do the proceeds of the sales of this flag go? Do they go to support these efforts?
Well, it depends on the manufacturer. The one that we use is here in the United States, and all proceeds above cost do to come to us. But the flag manufacturers have not been inclined to donate proceeds or a percentage of proceeds to support our efforts. I'll just say that Our flag, we are very proud to say, now represents all POW MIAs, all wars. We're glad that it does. We gave it up readily to be able to support the efforts to support the benefits for our returned POWs, to support efforts to discover World War II remains in Europe, for instance, and in the Pacific Islands, and to disinter the remains of World War II veterans and be able to identify them now and bring them back home to our country so that their families can pay their respects and have them back at home. And then too, even North Korea recently returned, it looked like caskets of 55 Americans. It was the remains of over 200 Korean War Americans, or that were Korean War veteran Americans that were included in those 55 caskets. And the fact that this effort is going forward, it's because we don't give up. We feel it's the obligation to those serving today that our nation makes every effort to stand behind them, stand with them. If they're serving our country and they get captured or become missing, and it's something I know all our returned POWs strongly support as well. So
Absolutely.
It's our honor to be able to share that logo and to know that it's flying literally around the world and
Right.
recognize for doing
Well,
so.
more conversation to be had on this. What a fantastic topic, and we hope to have more of our audience's participation. When we return, we will conclude our panel conversation, but first, we honor the service of Colonel Mary Catherine Pugh, Army veteran in this month's Shadowbox segment. Retired Colonel Mary Catherine Pugh was born in East Chicago, Indiana. She began her military service in August of 1988 at the Ordnance Center and School at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. It was the start of a career in the U.S. Army that would span over 29 years of commissioned service and include many awards, medals, and honors. She remembers her service with this box of coins, as she says, "I cherish these coins. Each one of these coins reminds me of missions I was on and commanders or command sergeant majors that I either worked for or supported. We honor her service." Welcome back. We're talking about POWs and MIAs. We want to welcome you to contact us with questions or comments. Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1 or email us veteransvoices@ContraCostaTV.org. I want to take a moment to acknowledge National Vietnam War Veterans Day this month, the 29th of March. So this is our last segment. And Obi, I want to come back to you. You're still with us. We didn't hear from you in the second segment. But Obi and Robert, I want to hear, what has life been like since your time as a prisoner of war ended? How hard, we understand the hardship that you endure as a prisoner, but once you come back home, is life just easy and peachy, or are some of the experiences of being a prisoner of war still there as you transition home from war? Obi, let's start with you, sir.
Yes, I forgot something to tell you as far as what Robert said. I was a longtime commissioner for our POW North State chapter here in California for a long time. And that talking what he did, it made me feel good because I did that to be with my ex-POWs and their families, and we became good friends. And too bad there's not that many at my age still alive, and that is what a sad thing is.
Now, Robert, share a little bit with us about your experience after coming home as a prisoner of war.
Sure. The first thing that happened to me was that the Department of Defense said that we could have any job we wanted in the military that we were medically qualified to fulfill. And I had felt a call to go into ordained ministry. And the Air Force agreed to send me to seminary on active duty. So off I went on active duty to the Episcopal Seminary in Sewanee, Tennessee, and then transitioned from the line of the Air Force to the chaplaincy when I graduated and was ordained. I stayed on active duty then until the fall of 1977. Went off to the reserves at that point, served Episcopal churches around the country, and reserve duty with the Air Force in various bases around the country until I retired at the Air Force Academy in 1999. Now, you can take the boy out of the war, but it's really hard to take the war out of the boy. And so obviously there were some effects of having been in combat that stayed with me for a very long time and had to be worked through. And then in 2007, then I was appointed by the Secretary of Defense to serve on the Defense Health Board for 10 years. And have been very active in veterans advocacy since that point.
Well, that's great, and I think you alluded to taking the boy out of the war, but not taking the war out of the boy. I would imagine there's a lot of effects of post-traumatic stress that do continue to affect many, not only of our combat veterans, but our ex-prisoners of war. Obi, I want to come back to you with another question. And of course, Robert, I hope to hear from you on this question as well. There aren't a lot of former prisoners of war left. As you've mentioned, there's very few World War II or Korean War veterans. And Robert, earlier you mentioned that there's even the Vietnam veterans are getting up in their 70s and 80s. With the population of former prisoners of war declining, and that's a positive thing in many ways, but what can we do as a country? What can we do as a country to continue to honor the experiences and the legacy of our former prisoners of war? And what can we do, Anne, as well, to ensure that we continue the work to bring home as many of our MIA and former prisoners that are still missing? Any one of you from our panel, please.
Well, I'll go first. I often tell people, as much as honoring and remembering is deserved, especially by returned POWs, not just those who served, but by returned POWs, and also many who served. But as much as we can honor and remember them, I can tell you point blank, the much harder job is fighting to get the rest of them home and accounted for. And for that, we need the help of the veterans community, because veterans have such a unique place in the hearts and minds of the American people, and the influence that you have with Congress, both through organizations like Bob Surton's American ex-POWs, but the VFW, the American Legion, the VVA, the DAV, all these veterans organizations have tremendous influence. And I can tell you point blank, if it hadn't been for some really tough times that we overcame until President Reagan came into office, we wouldn't have made it even until the early and mid 1980s. And since that time, it's been veterans on more than one occasion that helped us keep going, to prod our own government to keep up the priority. So yes, we need the help of all veterans, current, active duty, reservists, those who served before, our returned POW community. Yes, honor and remember them all. But if you can do anything to help us, make your views known to your elected representatives across the country, because we need that help more than anything, more than money, more than anything. We need people to know that our American veterans care and want their comrades in arms returned to our country where they belong.
Right, absolutely. A lot of value in people just having awareness and having a voice in regards to how important this topic is. We have a question from our audience, and so I'm going to interrupt my own question to our panel to address this question. Our audience mentions that they remember private citizens wearing bracelets printed with the name of American servicemen and women, and they wanted to know, were these bracelets associated with the efforts to return prisoners of war and MIAs? Robert, Obi, do you remember these bracelets? And okay, Robert, tell us a little bit about these. I think I remember my mom wearing one when I was a young boy, but help us understand, what's the significance of these?
Well, the National League of Families made these for known prisoners of war and missing of action in Vietnam. And people around the country wore them to remind each other, to keep that connection going, and to put pressure, frankly, on the North Vietnamese for better treatment. I think they came about first after the infamous Hanoi parade, where the prisoners were shackled and marched through town and were beaten and barely escaped with their lives. At that point, the North Vietnamese army lost control of the situation. And so while it was intended to be a propaganda plus for the North Vietnam, it turned out to be a disaster for them. Started an international letter writing campaigns. The National League of Families was heavily involved in that. And a lot of pressure began to be put on North Vietnam to improve the treatment of prisoners of war being held by them during those last few years.
Yeah.
So this is one that had my name on it, and the blue star there meant that I actually came home.
Oh, remarkable. Okay. I didn't know that. Yep. Obi, we just have about 2 minutes left, sir. What would you conclude in regards to this conversation? How should we move forward in the effort to recognize our former prisoners of war and our MIAs?
I want to say one thing. I had no bracelet. We had collected the dog tag POWs. A lot of the men that I had in my units, in my POW group, had these, but somehow we did not have the bracelets. But otherwise, to these POWs, I can remember what I went through, and I know what they're doing through right now, what things are going. And all we can say is God bless these ex-POWs and the POWs that passed away and their families. Great, all of them. Thank you.
Absolutely, Obi. I really honor your service, sir, and all that you endured. Robert, yours as well. And Anne, your family, with the loss of your brother, and the work that you all continue to do to raise this issue to the attention of everyone. You know, wars continue and wars end and new wars begin, but we should never forget our service members who were held as prisoner of war and those who are left missing in action. And I certainly hope that our audience learns something from our guests tonight and make a commitment to support their efforts. This concludes our panel discussion. We hope that our guest stories, again, have moved and inspired you. Get involved. A little later, we will have a list of resources to help start your search for a loved one who is missing in action or find support for an ex-prisoner of war. Now, it is time to hear a veteran's voice. This month, Veterans Voices correspondent Stephen Burchick talks with Marine veteran Lee Halverson.
I'm Steve Burchick with Veterans Voices, and this segment is A Veteran's Voice. We're filming here in the Veterans Memorial Building in Danville, and our guest today is Lee Halverson. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be here.
Can you briefly describe your military career? Understand it was actually kind of a long one.
It was. I originally planned on just enlisting and coming out and doing something else, but coming out of high school, I wasn't really prepared for college, so I decided to enlist in the Marine Corps. Vietnam was just starting up, and they said, there's a good chance you're going. I says, okay. So I was off within the week down to San Diego for Marine training. Completed that in December of that year. They sent me home for Christmas. I went back for training in January, and they sent me to on-the-job training as a food service technician or cook for 2 months there at the mess hall there. And then we loaded up the ship and had a slow boat to Vietnam. Arriving in Vietnam, I was assigned to 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 3rd Marine Division. On my way out, I went by the career planner to see what he could do for me about sticking around another week or so. And he says, well, I can't do that, but how would you like a new job? And hence, I went into the Weather Service. Went to school up in Lakehurst, 6-month school. went to warrant officer school and came out and went immediately to Korea for a tour, which we did one short tour down in, visit down in not to Korea, to Iwakuni, Japan, of which we did a couple-week visit down to on Team Spirit exercise. And the rest of the time was kind of downhill. Once I got into warrant officer, after 2 or 3 years, I was eligible to put in for what we call a limited duty officer, that you stay technical, but you pick up first lieutenant.
Okay.
And I actually ended up retiring as a captain after 23 and a half years.
Well, Lee, after you left the Marines, what was your civilian life like? What kind of path did you follow?
Well, I decided to go back to school so I could get a job in environmental protection. So I went over to Cal State Hayward for 2 years doing a BS in geology, and then 2 years of grad school in geochemistry. During that period, I was offered a job by California EPA Department of Toxics, who do hazardous waste management oversight in the state of California. I did 10 years with them. My last 6 years was household hazardous waste management for the state of California.
Lee, how long have you been a volunteer at the Veterans Building, and how did you get started?
I joined the VFW in '89 when I retired from the Marines, and over the years we decided that the building was kind of getting dilapidated. We had 2 organizations using it, the VFW and the American Legion. They had one room, the meeting upstairs, and occasionally did a fundraiser down in the big auditorium. But the building was getting dilapidated. We decided that we needed to do something about that, so we looked around for a new location. Didn't work out. We couldn't afford to build a new place and buy a new ground for it. So we decided to work with the town of Danville and fund a refurbishment of this building here. It took us about 2 years once we got started. While we were fundraising, we got kicked off and broke ground in 2010 and reopened it in 2012 in April. We're having our 10th anniversary this April.
Okay, looking forward to that.
Uh-huh.
Can you describe the museum here at the Veterans Memorial Building?
Okay, well, we decided not to go too much more before World War I. Was that the last major war in the 20th century. We covered through World War II, Korea, Vietnam era, and the Desert Storm, and later sandbox wars, as some of us like to call them, that go into Afghanistan and Iraq, which have been very long-term also, much like Vietnam. There's another long war that's fortunately recently ended.
In terms of special items, what are a couple of the more interesting items that...
Well, I think we have a few of the weapons for the earlier eras, World War I and World War II. We have a nice model display of aircraft that are very well done by the person who donated them. We have a kind of an evolution of eating utensils that are on display, starting with what they called a meat can in World War I. We have a series of gas masks from World War I on through Vietnam. We also have a couple nice displays of corpsman or medic type equipment that they use to save lives in the field.
About how many visitors a year do visit the museum here in the
Well,
building?
on any one day, it's hard to say. Sometimes there is none in the 6-hour period. We're open from 9 to 3. And other days, we'll get a small class or a group of scouts. Civilians are visiting from Europe who were veterans in their own countries that wonder if they can join the group here. But mostly walk in as they're walking by our front door, seeing our sign out there, the museum and library. We probably get anywhere from 5 to 10 a week, maybe several hundred a year.
When did you start coordinating the docent program here at the museum?
And they do 3-hour shifts, and I do the assignments, and we have about 22, 23 people that do that work right now, and they are they study the reference material and the displays so that they can explain to the individuals that do visit us.
Lee, this is a pretty impressive building. How many veterans groups or organizations does the building serve?
Well, we actually serve the traditional organizations like the American Legion, the VFW, Marine Corps League, and the Vietnam veterans of Dabo Valley. But there are smaller organizations like the Navy Nurse Corps, the Military Order of the World Wars, Military Officers Association of America. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody important. We do have a combat veterans motorcycle group that cover the entire Bay Area that meet here periodically just to have a place to call home.
Well, that's a pretty impressive group. Looks like you provide support to a lot of people. Lee, I understand that the museum you have here, you have year-round, but once a year you expand that museum?
Yes, that's correct. Our committee of the ones that run the actual displays and so forth, plus all the other organizations, chip in to help out putting on an expanded museum out on the main floor for a couple days on a weekend, either just prior to or just after Veterans Day.
Is that the one where you bring in a helicopter and a fighter jet?
That's correct. We bring in a F-8 Crusader cockpit for the kids to climb in and enjoy, and the Huey that's brought in from Concord.
I want to thank you for being with us today and sharing your story.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Appreciate it.
All right, my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into the show tonight. We hope that you were moved and inspired by our panel stories. Here are some resources for former prisoners of war and those searching for those who remain lost. If you want to research a loved one who is missing in action, the best place to start is the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. Find them at dpaa.mil. American Ex-Prisoners of War is a national advocate for prisoners of war and their families. Connect with them at axpow.org or call 817-649-2979. The National League of POW MIA Families is dedicated to telling the stories of ex-American prisoners of war and locating those still missing. You can find them at pow-miafamilies.org or by calling 703-465-7432. On Saturday, March 19th at 5 p.m., Contra Costa County's combined veterans service organizations are holding a corned beef dinner fundraiser for the Veterans Memorial Building in Danville. Contact Dennis Giacovelli at houseworks@pacbell.net or Lee Halverson at lhasmatir@aol.com for tickets. A Vietnam 50th commemoration ceremony will be held at the Nut Tree Airport in Vacaville at noon on Saturday, March 26th. To learn more, email joseph.moglia@va.gov. There will be a Veterans Job and Resource Fair at the Concord Veteran Memorial Building on April 28th from 10 a.m. to noon. If you're an employer who wants to hire veterans, contact Dennis Rojas at 925-791-3716 to learn how to participate. Veterans Voices is brought to you in part by contributions from the Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation, dedicated to helping veterans near you. American Legion Post 246, honoring the tradition of the American Legion in Danville. To rewatch tonight's episode, check back on our homepage later this week or check your cable provider's schedule for rebroadcast times. You can also rewatch this episode and many others on our YouTube channel, Veterans Voices of Contra Costa, so be sure to subscribe. Our next show will air on Monday, April 11th at 7 p.m. We will be talking about Native Americans' service in the military. You won't want to miss it. To all of our veterans and their families, thank you for serving. To all of you who tuned in tonight, thanks for watching and have a great evening.